I want to thank Wayne for this invitation to this workshop that really comes in time for me because I've only been working in this research department at the Keck, which really looks like your research department and which is kind of unique in France, for a year and a half. And next year we're going to have the 10th anniversary of the Musée du Keck, and we are going to organize a big conference about what it means to do research in an anthropology department. And one of the topics we thought to give to this conference was material temporalities of the objects. And we wanted to think about what it means to do research in museums of anthropology that are caught in what I would call the acceleration of time in the sense of Hartmut Rosa. As you may know, the Museum of Keck has answered the criticism for its permanent exhibition that is considered as primitivist and out of time by an abundance of exhibitions that constantly display or disrupt the criticism or evade the criticism. We have about 10 exhibitions a year, which is quite a lot. And we're trying to slow down with research, even if we organize also 10 conferences a year. And we also, I think you're quite, you're also accelerating here. Yes. So we have to think of these temporalities of research, exhibition, conservation, communication is also a big deal. And all these temporalities fit together in a museum of anthropology. And I want to share, so I'm not going to talk about this, but I want to keep this in mind as an horizon for this conference. I want to talk about the research I've been doing before entering the museum, and it's part of a book that I am actually writing, so I would be really happy to share your comments. When I entered the Musée du Keck, when they asked me to come, I thought, why do they want someone who worked on avian influenza? And when I passed by the garden, I saw these ducks. And in the 6 months after I arrived, these ducks got sick. 6 of them got sick. And they didn't ask me to check the health of these ducks. They were intoxicated by probably the bad water. So I thought I have to do something else than check for the health of ducks. And I realized that when you enter the museum, you have all these objects containing bird parts, feathers, but also beaks, and some of them with a very long history, because the royal cabinets that are the source of the anthropology collections of France contained a lot of objects coming from South America, North America, or Polynesia, that have a lot of feathers in the objects. So there's a lot of problems for the curators to preserve the colors of these feathers and to think about the materiality of these feathers. There are different kinds of structures explaining the colors of these feathers. We've had a conference about this. So one of the questions that interests me is how the preservation of the materiality of these bird objects raises questions about the projection in the future. And that's the question I want to raise. But yesterday I was in Rotterdam, and it's actually a question that is also interesting for Dutch people. The Natural History Museum is very close to the Erasmus Medical Center, which is actually the biggest bird virus bank in Europe. The biggest experts of avian influenza are in the Netherlands. I've worked with them in the last 5 years. And when you look at the other part of the museum park, you see this duck, once again, and you see the Boymans Museum, where there are interesting contemporary art with bird drones and bird radars. So there seems to be an interesting relation to birds in the Netherlands too. Actually, the most numerous cases of avian influenza in Europe are in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands has the highest density of poultry farms in Europe. We have had just yesterday a case of H5N1 in France, maybe related to the terrorist attacks of last week, because there's, as I will try to show, there's this kind of connection between terrorist attacks and H5N1 outbreak narratives. But I'm interested by the fact that the Netherlands has the highest density of poultry farms, the highest density of museums in Europe, and the most intense reflection on bird preservation. I don't know if my colleagues in microbiology would laugh at that. They probably haven't thought about that. So my fieldwork was about Hong Kong as a sentinel post for avian influenza. And the story is that this former British colony in 1997 had this strange new bird virus, H5N1, killing 5,000 poultry and infecting 12 people, 8 of whom died. And this virus spread all over the world, first Southeast Asia, then Japan, Russia, Europe, and Africa. And so the work that has been done by microbiologists in Hong Kong was to, to follow the mutations of this virus as it spread worldwide and to raise the alarm of the pandemic potential of this pathogen. So I thought a lot anthropologically about this position of the Hong Kong territory as a very dense hub of commodities and persons in this global alarm on pandemic pathogens. And the reason why Hong Kong was considered as this sentinel post is that Hong Kong is a very small territory. You have a lot of poultry consumed in traditional cuisine, and a lot of wild birds also, migratory birds. And all these wild and domestic birds are concentrated in the highest density of human population in the peninsula of Kowloon. This is a map that the bird watchers of Hong Kong have built to show that the migratory birds are not responsible for the spread of H5N1 at the border with China, but rather that the most numerous cases of H5N1 on wild birds are in the central market of Kowloon. So there is this idea that you can study the mutations of the virus in this very concentrated space, but the idea is that this virus appears in the south of China because you have human pigs and a lot of birds. And so Hong Kong is the place where you see these mutations that remain invisible in the south of China. Now, this idea has been launched by Australian microbiologists in the 1970s, and they were trained by this very important figure of the history of microbiology, Frank McFarlane-Burnett, who is the head of the School of Australian Immunology. And Burnett is one of also the founders of the surveillance of the mutations of flu viruses, influenza viruses, at the WHO. And the idea of WHO was to map all the mutations of flu viruses, particularly in birds. And the problem they had was that China was not part of WHO. So they used Hong Kong as the place where the information from China could be captured and then spread to England, US, partly France. But I'm interested in this quote at WHO, which is a kind of official declaration, that the WHO coordinating all these labs collecting information about viruses is going to be a museum for desiccated strains of influenza viruses. So the idea is that the coordination of labs will produce a kind of inventory of the knowledge we have about bird mutations. This is very much linked to evolutionary hypothesis. This is before DNA, and now people do that with gene bank, data bank. But at the time, it was really material desiccated strains. And there was the problem of how you can preserve these desiccated strains. Now, at the same time, you have this important figure of French anthropology, Paul Rivet, who was the founder of the Musée de l'Homme, who said that basically a museum of anthropology should be considered as a lab, because its role is not only to preserve ethnographic objects, but also to show them to the public in such a way that the public would be educated about, as we saw this morning, the unity of mankind despite the apparent diversity of races. And it was also part of an evolutionary narrative. Now, in the 1980s, as Peter has reminded us this morning, there was this shift from this evolutionary model, both in biology and in anthropology, where labs were not only the place where pathogens were conserved, but also spaces of contagion. There was all this debate about the escape of dangerous pathogens from labs, with all the fear about bioterrorism. Soviet labs literally exploding, and potential pathogens coming through, disseminating through nature and possibly in terrorist caves. So there was all this fear about the use of pathogens as terrorist weapons. And at the same time, there was all this debate about museums as not only closed entities of preservation of ethnographic objects, but as contact zones where indigenous people could come and share the knowledge and the performances with these objects. Now, I'm interested in this shift, but I think it's not only a spatial shift. It's not only opening museums and labs. It's not only a shift from a big colonial metropolis, Paris, London, Washington, that share their universal vision of the world, to a kind of multipolar world with open institutions. I want to look at the way this has changed our conception of time, and particularly our relation to the future. Now, I want to use a framework that I borrowed to some colleagues from California, from Berkeley. They're all students of Paul Rabinow, so this is part of an anthropology of the contemporary after the postmodern turn in anthropology. And so it's also very much a development on the hypothesis of Michel Foucault's biopower, or biopolitics. And it takes a term that is actually circulating in many different places, farms, borders, labs, but also maybe museums, which is the norm of biosecurity, which is the idea that you are going to regulate the circulation of living material between institutions that are supposed to be closed. So how do you control the circulation of dangerous or endangered living material in a time of, if you want, neoliberal circulation? And so the work that Andy Lakoff and Stephen Collier have done is to go back to the history of this problem of biosecurity, and to show that it relies on the technique of preparedness. That you have to prepare for an impending doom or an emerging catastrophe that you cannot calculate, because basically we have new threats, danger can come from everywhere. So it's not like national states that can calculate the risk based on statistics of epidemics or drought or earthquakes. But you have to prepare the population by the imagination of the coming catastrophe. So it's a new representation of the future that is not calculated, but that goes through collective imagination. And Lakoff and Collier show that there are three techniques that are actually transferred from the world of nuclear protection or civil defense in the US after the Cold War and during the Cold War, to, after the Cold War, all kinds of natural disaster, natural hazards. So these are sentinels, that is the use of non-human devices to warn humans for a threat that is going to affect them lately. So we have collected this series of articles on sentinel devices covering all kinds of natural disasters, from nuclear radiations to threatened species to infectious disease, even endocrine disruptors. It's available online. And another technique is simulations, that is the performances where you ask people to play the catastrophe by scenarios. And then the third technique is stockpiling of weapons, of masks, protective equipment. And I won't go too far in the first two, but I look particularly at the question of stockpiling for today. So what does it mean to stockpile material to prepare for a coming catastrophe? Now, this is a map that has been made by the curators of the Musée du Quai Branly, and they have tried to trace the movements of insects in the museum. And what they have discovered is that the highest density of insects in the museum is in the open storage. So the open storage is the one you find when you enter the museum. And what does it contain? It contains musical instruments. Why does it contain musical instruments? Because musical instruments have a low value on the art market. They are made of wood, mostly, and they are not masterpieces. And where are the masterpieces? As I said this morning, they are in the Louvre, but also most of them are underground. And you don't have access to the reserves underground. So the interesting thing is that when Jean Nouvel built the building, the museum, when he drew the maps, the plans for the museum, he wanted to have everything on open storage. So you would have had the permanent exhibition and the open storage. But instead of that, because it was too costly, they built these pillars, so now you have the garden, and the storage are underground. So it's only 5% of the collections that are open storage. Now, if you try to go to the closed storage, to the underground storage, that will take a lot of time. Only 3 people in the museum have access to the underground storage. And they have a system of biological recognition of the prints. I don't have access to the storage. And when the objects themselves enter this underground storage, for example, when they exit for an exhibition and when they re-enter the storage, they have to go through this room, which is called anoxia, which takes the oxygen out of the atmosphere so that all the insects in the object would die, and then the objects that are clean can enter the storage again. You have this nice exhibition at this moment about fish skin clothes. I see you have those also here. And they're particularly vulnerable. And they have special storage where the temperature is 5 degrees. And that's why for this exhibition they have to rotate the fish skin clothes many times. Now another interesting technique they have is a simulation of the flood of the River Seine. Every year we have this simulation, because the crazy thing about Parisian museums is that they are all built on the side of the River Seine. And we expect the next flood, what we call the 100-year flood of the River Seine, and we have 72 hours to take the objects out of the underground reserve and put them on the top part of the museum. And so I took part to this as an anthropologist. It was very interesting. So we take the objects out of the reserve, we put them on trolleys, we go to the lift, and then we go upstairs. What they discovered in the last simulation that I took part to is that this lift is actually used for the kitchen. And so there is a possibility of transmission of pathogens or any kind of biological entity through the kitchen. So there are still gaps, as they say. But the other interesting thing I discovered is that when they built this underground storage, they classified the objects of the museum not by origin, not by cultural areas, but by priority by order of priority of evacuation. And what are the first objects in priority for evacuation for a flood? These are not objects that are vulnerable to flood. These are objects that have the highest value on the art market. And these are the ones that should be preserved. And there is a big discussion between the curators of the museum and the administration of the museum on how to change this order of classification of the objects. Because the curators want to have the traditional order where they are classified by material, function, origin, and the administration still wants to have this order of priority for flood because this is their main concern. You may remember that the very big obsession for the administration of the Musée du Quai Branly is that the researchers of the Musée de l'Homme didn't know how to preserve the objects. And so the big shift in the transfer, which is more neutral than capture, the transfer of the objects from the Musée de l'Homme to the Musée du Quai Branly is that these objects are going to be secured for the first time. Now, this is my final slide. I'm interested in the shift from storage to stockpiling as two rationalities of time, of projecting in the future, from prevention to preparedness. I'm in it, and I'm interested in how not only it projects in the future, but it creates value for the present. And it's very interesting to think about the value of objects, because it's not only value on the art market, there's value about knowledge, there's the aesthetic value, which is another thing. Now, in the logic of storage, which is the classical rationality of 19th century museum, the value of objects comes from the completion of a collection. And we've seen that this morning. So you build a fixed image of humanity, and you want to prevent future disasters by encompassing them in a kind of rational image of what humanity should be. And this is very much the idea of Paul Rivet, right? And now stockpiling, in stockpiling, the value of objects comes from the speculation on their loss. So you think that they could be destroyed, and they have value because they could be destroyed. Not only because the societies they come from could be destroyed, but the materiality of the objects themselves could be destroyed. And I want to finish by my two epistemic heroes. Benoit's epistemic hero is Malinowski. I have two heroes, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl and Claude Lévi-Strauss, for very different reasons than what you might expect. There was interesting discussions between Lucien Lévy-Bruhl and Paul Rivet in the 1930s, who were both founders of the Institut d'Ethnologie, about what it meant to prepare for the next war. Lucien Lévy-Bruhl was older than Paul Rivet. He had taken part to the Dreyfus affair, and he really thought that the colonies are going to rebel against French authority. He took part to the plans for decolonization of Algeria, while Paul Rivet, as you may know, his career ended basically in the anti-decolonization movement. And as for Lévi-Strauss, there is this famous distinction between cold societies and hot societies, which is one of the classical ideas about the non-historicity of primitive societies. Well, it's very strange to see that the definition of cold societies for Lévi-Strauss is basically societies that have store, and that give meaning to event by referring to the store of names and classification. Whereas the hot societies is the societies that take event to give meaning to the materials they have. And interestingly, Lévi-Strauss made this distinction while he was the vice director of the Musée de l'Homme. And at that time, in some way, he wanted museums to be cold societies, in societies that were decolonizing. But I think that when he supported the project of the Musée du Quai Branly, he had a very different ideas of the future. He had these discourses about the catastrophe that is going to come. And I could say, that's my hypothesis, that Lévi-Strauss himself shifted from prevention to preparedness, from storage to stockpiling. Thank you.